And the reason for doing this was, there were multiple reasons. What people need to appreciate is that not just the temperature on the ground of the protesters, but the temperature of the general public to this protest was amplifying as well. And I could not, as mayor, I could not, as chair of the Windsor Police Services Board, direct police operations and tell the chief or the police administration how to move forward and when to move forward. I had no clear line of sight on how many resources were coming here. I knew there, I'm getting dribs and drabs of, yes, some folks are en route. Well, are they en route from Alberta? Are they en route from Newfoundland? Are they coming from Aurelia? I have no sense of the timing. And so the public temperature to this protest was also growing rapidly, to the point where you had Facebook groups being set up where people wanted to go out and undertake sort of vigilante type justice on the streets to remove these protesters themselves. And it was, as it relates to, the pandemic that we'd all lived through, in Windsor, we had lived through the same thing that many others have lived through, the stops and the starts of businesses, people not getting paid for a period of time, and going through that frustration and friction as we've all dealt with the pandemic collectively. And so just when we were at a point where there seemed to be light on the horizon, this was seen to be very, how do I say it, assaultive to many people in Windsor, that this was a small group of people, a relatively small group of people who were now going to jeopardize their employment. And so you had, like I said, Facebook groups that were starting where people were suggesting, and union leadership suggesting they were prepared to help move the protesters themselves and take action themselves. And so part of the reason for applying for the injunction was to send a signal to the public that I'm doing everything, that the city is doing everything, that city council is doing everything we can from our side of the table to try and resolve this issue. It was really the only positive step I could think of taking that would be helpful in terms of a signal to the public. Before I did this, I did talk to the chief and said, would this be helpful to you? And she said, listen, it won't hurt. And so on the morning of the 10th, very early, we activated legal teams to start putting the materials together, trying to see if we could get a scheduled appointment in court to present the application. And I worked with our Commissioner of Legal Services and our city manager and all of the right people on the city side to see that move forward very quickly. And so, the conversation really was first thing in the morning, 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, and by 2 o'clock we were appearing in front of Justice Morwitz to have this discussion.
Right. So I'll
and I would just say,
yes,
so the one part was the public, letting the public know we're doing everything we can. The other thing was putting, another arrow in the quiver for police. It was another tool that they could use with respect to saying you are now in violation. If we were successful in getting the injunction, that you were in violation of this injunction, and it was another arrow in their quiver.
And so City Council adopted a resolution that an injunction be sought, right?
Correct.
And this was on February 10.
That's right.
So you were able to call a meeting that quickly to get everybody together from the 9th when you kind of conceived this to the 10th.
That's right.
And it seems like the police was on board with the injunction. They thought it wouldn't hurt in any event.
Wouldn't hurt.
And so ultimately, as you say, the injunction became effective at 7 p.m. on February 11, is my understanding. Is that right?
That's correct.
And why was the city an intervener in that application and not the main applicant? Do you know?
I think through our discussions before we proceeded, we talked about who was most impacted, and how could we tell the story here about who was impacted. And it was clear in the first 60 minutes of Huron Church Road being blocked, our phone rang at the mayor's office from our largest employer, Chrysler, or now Stellantis, to say what's going on at the Ambassador Bridge. There are 5,000 people directly who work in that facility making Chrysler Pacificas and minivans that rely on smooth and efficient border crossings because the whole industry, the whole auto industry works on a just-in-time basis. There's no parts being stored on site. They are brought in, and that bridge is moving, and the material is moving across that bridge every hour of every day. And so it's for perspective, the average part that goes into a car that rolls off the assembly line at the end of the manufacturing process, those parts have crossed the border on average 6 to 7 times, back and forth, Detroit, back to Windsor, as they continue to be, upgraded and built. And so within the first 60 minutes, they called and said, what's going on at the Ambassador Bridge? And so we knew that the APMA, the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, the CVMA, the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, were impacted dramatically by the activity at the bridge. And so they were certainly, good parties to put forward the request, and then we took the role, we played the role that we played, I think, appropriately.
And so my understanding is the Attorney General of Ontario was also an intervener in that application.
That's correct.
And how did they become involved, and what was the coordination with them like?
I'm not sure.
Okay, who took the lead on the injunction from the city's side?
Shelby Askenhager, who's our Commissioner of Legal Services.
Okay, so she would have had the coordination with the Attorney General, is that right?
She would be the one in the best position to answer your question.
Okay, fair enough. So as we said, on February 11 at 7 p.m., the injunction came into effect. It was extended then on February 18, is that right?
That's correct.
And what, if anything, did it change on the ground? What impact did it have, if any?
Well, I think that once the injunction became effective, that it sent a signal to the public that this has now, from the public watching from the outside, that we have done all that we can do. And again, it gave another tool to police to go in, and they did. When the police went in and actually had to arrest people, those folks were charged with violating the terms of the injunction. And so it sent a signal, but I think, I would like to think that from a protester's perspective, it also meant that the protesters had their day in court, had the opportunity to present their position to Justice Morowitz, Chief Justice Morowitz, and have a conversation in court through the established legal structures that we have in place. All parties had a chance to do that. And Chief Justice Morowitz ultimately made his decision that was favorable to grant the injunction. But everybody had an opportunity. In fact, our application on February 10th was delayed and heard on February 11th to ensure that all parties, including the protesters, were given notice so that they could participate. Police went out and plastered every telephone pole, the Jersey barriers with copies of the order. We had to set up a website. We promoted it on social media. Certainly it was amplified in every major media source and through every social media channel that I saw.
If you could just slow down a bit
Sure.
for the interpreters.
Thank you. That there were great efforts made to make sure that all parties who had an interest in this application had an opportunity to have their day in court.
And the city, in fact, assisted to distribute these pamphlets once the injunction was granted to give notice of the injunction, is that right?
Correct.